Welcome back. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, there's a door no one dares to open. Not for 100 years has anyone approached the cellar hidden beneath a decaying homestead, and the few who know of it speak only in whispers. Locals avoid the place as if a shadow lingers over the earth itself, and the stories from 1889 are buried as carefully as the secrets the Frost sisters left behind. What happened in that valley isn't legend. It's recorded in county ledgers, coroner's notes, and eyewitness testimonies, yet most have chosen to forget, to erase it from memory. But some of us can't look away. The Frost sisters, Margaret and Catherine, were ordinary by appearance, living in a house that wouldn't have drawn attention if not for its strategic position. Nestled 3 miles up a logging road barely wide enough for a wagon, their homestead was the only crossing point between mining camps to the east and trading posts to the west. Travelers had no choice but to pass their door, and the sisters had a hospitality that seemed harmless, even comforting. Margaret, the older, would greet strangers with a smile, her hands offering bread, eggs, and warmth. Catherine was quieter, often hidden behind a window pane, her gaze unnervingly still. Those who noticed it at all described eyes that never blinked, as if observing something the mind couldn't grasp. At first glance they appeared innocent. A home in the mountains, 2 women managing life alone after their father's death in 1883, the harsh winters, the constant labor. It seemed remarkable, even admirable. But the sisters understood isolation in ways no one else did. They knew that men passing through the mountains were vulnerable, tired, and reliant on the goodwill of strangers. They used this knowledge, weaponized it, and turned their home into a place of calculated control. The cellar beneath their house was, as no ordinary storage. It was a trap, dressed as comfort. People came expecting a warm meal and a place to rest. Margaret provided both, gently directing weary travelers toward the cellar, assuring them it was warmer than the main house. The first chamber offered blankets, a small stove, and a false sense of security. But deeper inside, hidden behind the facade of root storage bins, a second chamber waited. Windowless, locked from the outside. Darkness swallowed whoever entered, leaving them at the mercy of the sisters. This is where the true horror begins. Not with ghosts or whispers, but with human calculation, patience, and the terrifying ease with which 2 women could turn everyday kindness into a deadly ritual. Over the years, the Frost sisters perfected their method, and for every traveler who vanished, another would unknowingly walk toward the same fate. By the time anyone began to suspect, the pattern had already been cemented into the valley itself, written into the very ground beneath Hollow Creek, West Virginia. Before we go further, remember this. History isn't just what's recorded. Sometimes the most horrifying truths are those that are deliberately hidden. And in the case of the Frost sisters, some doors are better left unopened. Next, we will explore Appalachia in the 1800s, a land of isolation, secrecy, and survival, where the Frost sisters' understanding of their environment made the mountains itself an accomplice to their crimes. To understand the Frost sisters, you first need to understand Appalachia in the late 1800s. These weren't the tourist-friendly mountains we picture today. This was a place carved by isolation, where families lived miles apart, winters were brutal, and survival demanded a stubborn silence. People didn't just keep to themselves, they had to. A misstep could mean frostbite, starvation, or death. Roads were little more than worn paths, and the dense forest swallowed travelers whole if they lost their way. In such a world, strangers were both a threat and a lifeline. Hollow Creek, where the Frost homestead stood, wasn't on most maps. The settlement existed in name only, a scattering of homes and cabins along a logging route. The Frost house sat at the only crossroads for miles, a rare waypoint for miners, merchants, and wandering hands. Those traveling west from the Pennsylvania coal camps or east from the trading posts had no choice but to stop, and stopping meant entering Margaret's smile. Margaret was methodical. She understood how trust worked in these mountains. A warm meal, a dry room, and polite conversation were enough to make weary men let their guard down. Catherine played a subtler role, mostly unseen, observing each visitor with an intensity that made even the bravest pause. Together, they created an illusion of ordinary domesticity. Bread baking in the oven, chickens clucking outside, the wind whistling through the pines. But below, the cellar waited, silent and patient. Travelers often arrived at dusk, tired from navigating slippery ridges or frozen roads. Margaret would greet them, assess them with a practiced eye, and subtly guide them to the cellar, framing it as a haven from the cold. The first chamber was convincing: a stove, blankets, warmth. She could have ended there, but she never did. Behind a wall of preserved roots and potato bins lay the second sea. Amber, no windows, locked from the outside, darkness complete and absolute. It wasn't only the physical isolation that made the Frost sisters so dangerous. They understood human psychology. They knew how exhaustion and trust could cloud judgment, how the polite refusal to offend a woman could trap a man in a place he would never leave willingly. Each traveler who entered the cellar was subjected to a subtle, controlled process. Drinks laced with carefully measured herbs left them weak, disoriented, and compliant. Margaret and Catherine moved with precision, never hurried, never sloppy. In their hands, even the act of hospitality became a tool of control. Between 1882 and 1889, at least 14 men vanished along this stretch of Appalachia, though records suggest the true number was likely higher. Many had no families, no employers tracking their movements, no one to ask questions. They disappeared quietly, swallowed by a valley that seemed indifferent, yet meticulously complicit. The Frost sisters' reign was less about violence in the open and more about the terror of anticipation, the slow, unseen, calculated domination that left victims unsure of reality itself. In the mountains of West Virginia, danger didn't announce itself. It didn't howl in the night. Sometimes it smiled at you, poured you tea, and offered a warm place to rest. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the mountains had already claimed another secret. Next, we will uncover the first confirmed disappearance, Thomas Wickham, and see how the Frost sisters' methods turned ordinary hospitality into something unthinkable. The first disappearance we can trace with certainty occurred in November of 1882. Thomas Wickham, a surveyor from Pennsylvania, was mapping mineral deposits in the Appalachian hills. A practical man, he had little interest in local gossip or cautionary tales, relying instead on maps, instincts, and the promise of warm lodging at night. His last recorded stop was the Frost homestead. Margaret greeted him with a smile that seemed ordinary enough, her hands offering bread and a steaming cup of tea. She asked about his journey, inquired if he was tired, and suggested he rest in the cellar, where it was warmer than the drafty upstairs rooms. The cellar seemed safe, inviting, even comforting. It was small but functional. A stove, blankets, and a sense of security that made a man forget the miles of treacherous roads behind him. But hidden beyond the rows of root storage bins was a second chamber, deeper and entirely concealed. No windows, no light, locked from the outside. It was here that the real horror began, though Wickham, like so many before him, could not have known it. Margaret had a way of making trust seem natural. She lingered long enough to ensure her visitor relaxed, then brought him tea or whiskey, subtly laced with herbs carefully prepared by Catherine. Hemlock, wild plants, and other toxins known only to the sisters left men disoriented and weakened, but alive. The goal wasn't immediate death. It was control, domination, and submission. Wickham drank, nodded in gratitude, and followed Margaret's gentle instructions, never suspecting the darkness waiting below the root bins. When he was finally guided deeper into the hidden chamber, the door was locked behind him. It was a small, windowless room with no exit. Darkness became his constant companion. Days, possibly weeks, would pass with minimal light, minimal sustenance, and no human contact apart from the Wutu, men who controlled every aspect of his existence. This methodical, deliberate cruelty would define the Frost sisters' pattern for years to come. When Wickham failed to return, his mining company sent inquiries. The sheriff visited the Frost property twice, each time receiving Margaret's calm assurances. Wickham had left early, seemed in good spirits, and headed west. No one doubted a woman's word in that isolated valley, and in the absence of evidence, the case quietly vanished. But for those who would later investigate, Wickham's disappearance marked the beginning of a terrifying pattern. Between 1882 and 1889, at least 14 men vanished along the same stretch of Appalachia. Records, mining logs, postal deliveries, family inquiries confirm names, yet the true number was almost certainly higher. Some men had no family to notice their absence, no employers to file reports. They were ghosts before the frost cellar ever claimed them. Their trust in hospitality, in kindness, became their undoing. This first case demonstrates a terrifying truth. Evil does not always announce itself with noise or threat. Sometimes it arrives softly, with a warm smile, a cup of tea, and a promise of comfort. And in that quiet, isolated valley, the Frost sisters' design went undisturbed, their secret chambers filled one by one, each disappearance reinforcing the method that would eventually shock a nation. Next, we will examine the sisters' calculated techniques, how they maintained control, ensured compliance, and transformed simple trust into a deadly trap. What set the Frost sisters apart wasn't simply cruelty, it was precision. They understood isolation, human psychology, and the power of routine. Margaret and Catherine didn't rely on brute force. Instead, they built a system so subtle that men willingly walked into it, convinced they were entering safety. The first chamber of the cellar was a masterstroke of deception, warm, well-lit, stocked with blankets, and seemingly ordinary. Travelers thought they were receiving Appalachian hospitality, a kindness that could mean life in the harsh mountains. But beyond this veneer, Catherine had created a second chamber, hidden behind root storage bins. Windowless, locked from the outside, and descending into darkness that swallowed sound and light, it was a place designed to isolate and control. Margaret guided the men there with a smile, offering tea or whiskey laced with carefully measured herbs. These weren't random poisons. They were subtle, weakening men without ending their lives immediately. Hemlock and other plants rendered victims disoriented, compliant, and unable to resist, yet still conscious enough to experience the slow, oppressive terror of the cellar. The sisters' understanding of timing and dosage was meticulous. No visitor died by accident. The process could stretch over days or weeks, leaving men in a state of helplessness while life continued above them. Margaret baked bread, tended the house, and smiled at the next traveler as though nothing was wrong. Catherine, always observing, monitored each victim, adjusting the effects of her concoctions like a scientist conducting a controlled experiment. They weren't killing for pleasure, they said. They were teaching, controlling, ensuring survival by preemptively removing threats. Pattern and ritual were central. Victims were almost always solitary men traveling through the mountains, arriving at dusk or in darkness, too tired to resist. The sisters knew that exhaustion and trust were powerful tools. Even the polite refusal to offend a woman in their time made men susceptible to manipulation. The cellar became a stage where the illusion of normality masked a horrifying reality. The effect on the victims went beyond physical suffering. Isolation in the second chamber stripped them of identity, turning them into numbers, objects, lessons. When they were finally discovered, sometimes alive, sometimes not, the evidence pointed to methodical cruelty. Injuries weren't random, they were deliberate. The men who survived could recall nothing but darkness, hunger, and the sound of footsteps above them, life continuing normally while they were trapped in a silent, oppressive nightmare. The Frost sisters' approach challenges everything we understand about power. It wasn't the strength of their hands, but the control of environment, trust, and perception. By exploiting human empathy and reliance on hospitality, they transformed the ordinary into a weapon. And it worked, year after year, until nature itself intervened. Floods, mudslides, and the slow collapse of a stone foundation would eventually reveal the horrors hidden beneath their home. Next, we will recount the flood of March 1889, the event that finally exposed the cellar and forced the Frost sisters' secret into daylight, changing the valley forever. March of 1889 arrived with a ferocity that the people of Hollow Creek had never seen. Snowmelt from the high ridges combined with 3 days of relentless rain, turning the narrow logging paths into treacherous rivers of mud. Creeks swelled into torrents, and the mountains themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of the storm. For most, it was a natural disaster, a test of endurance. For the Frost sisters, it was the beginning of the end. The relentless water undermined the stone foundation of their cellar, a weakness that had been carefully ignored for decades. One afternoon, a portion of the exterior wall gave way, exposing the hidden darkness beneath the house. 4 men from a nearby settlement, drawn by the sound of rushing water and the sight of debris tumbling down the hillside, approached the Frost property. What they found was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bones, scattered and half buried in mud, greeted their eyes first. But it wasn't just the sight. It was the smell, a stench that clung to the air despite the cold and rain. None of the men could adequately describe it later. They ran to the county seat, breathless and pale, reporting what they had stumbled upon. Sheriff deputies arrived within 48 hours, accompanied by a small contingent to investigate. The second chamber, the one Margaret and Catherine had so carefully concealed, was revealed in all its nightmarish detail. 3 men were found alive, but barely. One had been there since late January, another since early February, and a third, incoherent and unidentifiable, would die 4 days later under the care of the county doctor. The conditions defied description. 12 by 8 feet of absolute darkness, no heat, a single bucket that had gone unemptied for weeks. The survivors were emaciated, filthy, and deeply traumatized. Even more horrifying were the injuries, deliberate and methodical, clearly inflicted by human hands. The county doctor's report emphasized the systematic nature of the abuse, repeated and deliberate acts that left scars of power, domination, and cruelty. Over the next week, remains of at least 9 other men were uncovered, some buried in the chamber floor, others stacked in deeper excavations the sisters had made in the hillside. One skeleton showed signs of having been there for years, evidence of how long this pattern had persisted. The revelation of the frost cellar shocked the county and the region. What started as a natural disaster uncovered human evil meticulously hidden beneath layers of stone, soil, and silence. The mountains, which had shielded the sisters' crimes for so long, finally betrayed them. The flood didn't just destroy part of a foundation, it exposed a terrifying reality. The ordinary facade of the Frost homestead masked years of calculated captivity and death. Ordinary travelers, seeking warmth and comfort, had been led into darkness, their fates sealed by the quiet smiles of 2 women. For the first time, the valley understood the full scope of the horror that had been living among them. Next, we will explore the arrest of Margaret and Catherine Frost, their composure in the face of exposure, and the community's first confrontation with the unimaginable truth. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived at the Frost homestead, the scene was eerily ordinary. Margaret Frost opened the door with the same polite smile she had extended to countless travelers over the years. She offered coffee, asked if the men wanted to sit, and made conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. Catherine, meanwhile, remained upstairs in her room, quietly reading, seemingly unaware of the chaos unfolding below. The officers were struck by the sisters' composure. There was no panic, no pleading, no sudden flight. Arresting them felt to one deputy like taking 2 schoolteachers into custody for overdue library books. Margaret's calm demeanor was almost clinical. She inquired politely whether the deputies were cold, offering a coat, as though hospitality and courtesy were the normal protocol for encounters with law enforcement. Catherine, as always, said nothing, her eyes fixed on some distant point, unseen by anyone else. The valley had known whispers, rumors, and unexplained disappearances for years, but no one had ever imagined this level of premeditated cruelty. For decades, the Frost homestead had been an unassuming waypoint along the Appalachian trails. Travelers stopped for a meal, a warm bed, and friendly faces. And yet, beneath that normalcy, 2 women had been orchestrating systematic imprisonment, abuse, and death. The news of the arrests spread like wildfire through Hollow Creek and surrounding towns. People traveled for days to witness the beginning of the sisters' legal reckoning. Journalists arrived from Philadelphia, Baltimore, and beyond, eager to capture every detail. In a region where sensationalist reporting was rare, the story of the Frost sisters represented an extraordinary blend of horror, mystery, and human fascination. For the deputies, the arrest was the first glimpse into a nightmare that had operated in plain sight for years. Their disbelief was mirrored in the community's reactions. Neighbors who had known the sisters as quiet, polite, and unassuming were forced to reconcile that the people they had trusted and smiled at were capable of unimaginable acts. The juxtaposition of ordinary domesticity with hidden monstrosity became a central focus of the trial, journalists noting repeatedly the surreal calm with which the sisters conducted themselves even under suspicion. This arrest marked a turning point in the story. For decades, men had vanished into the mountains with no questions asked. Now, the valley faced a horrifying truth. Evil had walked among them, hidden in plain sight, nurtured by isolation, trust, and the subtle art of manipulation. Margaret and Catherine Frost had weaponized the very kindness that sustained life in these harsh lands, turning hospitality into a trap from which few returned. What the arrest revealed was more than just criminal activity. It exposed the fragile veneer of civility in an isolated society where trust and politeness could be exploited to devastating effect. And as the community grappled with shock, fear, and disbelief, the legal process began, setting the stage for a trial that would captivate a nation and forever stain the reputation of Hollow Creek. Next, we will delve into the trial of the Frost sisters, the testimonies that chilled the courtroom, and the unsettling calm with which Margaret explained her actions. The courthouse in the county seat had never seen anything like it. By late May of 1889, every available seat was filled, with people standing in hallways, pressed against walls, and perched on steps, all eager to witness the trial of the Frost sisters. Journalists had arrived from as far as Philadelphia and Baltimore, their notebooks ready to capture every chilling detail. The case transcended local interest. It was becoming a spectacle, a window into a horror that few could imagine. From the start, it was clear that the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The discovery of the second chamber, the survivors' testimony, and the physical remains of men who had been imprisoned and tortured for weeks formed an unshakable narrative. Yet what gripped the courtroom wasn't just the evidence. It was the way Margaret Frost presented herself. Calm, articulate, and almost professorial, she took the stand with an air of control that unsettled jurors and spectators alike. Margaret's testimony lasted 4 hours. She spoke not with desperation, but with clarity, explaining that the sisters' actions had been motivated by fear and survival. Their father had instilled in them a deep distrust of men, teaching them that men were dangerous and that vulnerability could lead to harm. After his death in 1883, they had been left alone in the mountains, exposed to the very dangers he had warned them about. According to Margaret, their methods were a preemptive form of protection, a way to control risk before it became lethal. She described in chilling detail incidents where travelers had made inappropriate advances toward Catherine, had refused to leave, or had violated boundaries. Margaret claimed that the cellar was not a place of murder, but a classroom of sorts, where men were shown the consequences of their behavior. "We were educators, not murderers," she stated, her voice steady, unwavering. To her, the men who died were lessons unlearned. The survivors had been cured of their potential for harm. Catherine Frost never spoke. Observers noted her stillness, hands folded, eyes fixed ahead, entirely detached from the courtroom. Her silence, coupled with Margaret's articulate defense, created an almost surreal atmosphere. It was as if the sisters existed in a different reality, one where morality and conventional human response were redefined. Witnesses for the prosecution recounted the systematic abuse, injuries that suggested deliberate, repeated acts, victims starved and trapped in total darkness, and men left to watch life continue above them while they suffered below. Physical evidence, including the skeletal remains and personal effects, corroborated the survivors' fragmented accounts, forming a grim tapestry of cruelty and control. The trial forced the community and the nation to confront a truth they had long suspected but never fully understood. The Frost homestead was a place where fear, isolation, and meticulous planning had transformed ordinary women into agents of terror. For the jurors, it was not merely a question of guilt, but of reconciling the ordinary appearances of Margaret and Catherine Frost with the extraordinary horrors they had engineered. Next, we will explore the jury's deliberation, the verdict, and the chilling sentences handed down to the Frost sisters, marking the final act of justice in a story that had haunted the Appalachian Mountains for decades. After days of harrowing testimony, the courtroom fell into tense silence as the jury retired to deliberate. The evidence had been overwhelming: survivors' accounts, skeletal remains, the hidden chamber beneath the homestead, and Margaret Frost's own calm explanations. Yet, for the people of Hollow Creek, the question wasn't only about guilt. It was about understanding how such evil could exist in plain sight, behind polite smiles and the guise of hospitality. The jurors spent less than 3 hours behind closed doors. When they returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, the tension almost unbearable. The foreman's voice broke the silence. Both Margaret and Catherine Frost were found guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and what the 1889 legal system termed aggravated assault with intent to cause suffering. The verdict left the spectators stunned. Some gasped aloud, others could only stare, unable to reconcile the ordinary faces of the sisters with the monstrous acts revealed in testimony. The judge, maintaining a strict formality, handed down the sentences: death by hanging. The execution date was set for July the 12th, 1889. For the residents of Hollow Creek, justice had been served, yet the horror lingered. Newspapers across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and even New York ran the story on their front pages, sensational yet factual. One New York Times headline read, "The She-Devils of Appalachia." The nation struggled to comprehend how two women could orchestrate such terror, and the Frost case became an enduring symbol of human capacity for cruelty when isolation and fear intersected. Between sentencing and the execution date, however, the story took an unexpected turn. Catherine Frost died in her cell on June 23rd. Official records labeled it a suicide. She had supposedly torn strips from her bedding and hanged herself from the cell bars, yet conflicting reports from the deputies on duty cast doubt over the official account. One claimed she had been asleep at midnight, another said the cell was never left unattended, and a third refused to comment entirely, resigning shortly after. The truth of Catherine's final moments remains one of history's chilling ambiguities. Margaret's reaction to her sister's death was as unnerving as her composure throughout the trial. Witnesses reported no tears, no outburst, no visible grief. She simply nodded once and said, "She always did finish things before me." The matter-of-fact acceptance highlighted a psychological depth that has fascinated criminal historians for over a century. A capacity to detach from ordinary human emotions, to see life and death through a lens of cold rationality. With Catherine gone, Margaret's execution was moved up. On June 30th, 1889, approximately 200 people gathered in the county courthouse yard. She walked to the gallows without assistance, calm as if on a daily stroll. The noose was fitted, and though the official transcript records no final words, contemporary newspaper accounts and a deputy's diary captured her parting message. "You think we were monsters, but we only did to them what they would have done to us. We were just faster." The execution was final, but the terror of the Frost homestead lingered. Within days, townspeople burned the property, collapsing the cellar and burying it under debris. The logging road was rerouted, and the area was administratively absorbed into a neighboring township. Hollow Creek effectively vanished from maps, a deliberate attempt to erase the location of horror, yet the memory persisted among the families of victims and the wider Appalachian community. Next, we will explore the aftermath of the Frost sisters' crimes, the ripple effects through Appalachia, and how trust in hospitality was forever altered. Read in the mountain valleys. The Frost sisters' story did not end with Margaret's execution. Though the homestead was destroyed, the valley's memory of Hollow Creek remained haunted, etched into the consciousness of those who lived nearby. The crimes had shattered more than the lives of their victims. They had shattered trust. For decades afterward, travelers approached mountain homesteads with suspicion. Offers of a warm bed or a meal were no longer greeted with blind gratitude. They were questioned, measured, and sometimes declined outright. Remote Appalachian families, particularly women running legitimate travelers' rests, experienced a sudden decline in customers. Men who once relied on hospitality to survive harsh winters became wary. A simple gesture of kindness, once a lifeline in the unforgiving mountains, had been weaponized by the Frost sisters, and the consequences were immediate and tangible. Property incomes collapsed, and some families lost their homesteads. The sisters had not only destroyed lives, they had eroded an entire culture of trust and communal support. Historians and criminal psychologists have studied the Frost case for over a century. Its uniqueness lies not in the number of victims or the brutality, though both were horrific, but in the psychological complexity behind the actions. Margaret and Catherine were not motivated by wealth, greed, or the pleasure of inflicting pain. They were motivated by fear and a need for control. The cellar, the drugs, the systematic abuse. These were tools to feel safe in a world they believed was inherently dangerous. In that twisted logic, dominance was protection. Every victim became both lesson and shield, proof that the sisters had power over the very danger they had been taught to fear. Survivors carried the psychological scars for life. Jacob Reinhardt, one of the few men to escape, described the enduring horror. It was not the hue, anger, the cold, or the injuries, but the sounds from above, the mundane footsteps, the laughter, the normal lives continuing while he was trapped in darkness. The experience left him unable to tolerate enclosed spaces or darkness for the rest of his life, a living testament to the long reach of trauma. Another survivor succumbed to physical deterioration within a year. A third lived silently, with memories too horrifying to speak aloud. Generationally, the Frost legacy extended only faintly, through a distant cousin who changed her name and moved away. Perhaps the universe offered a measure of mercy. Some bloodlines escaped the shadow. Yet academically, culturally, and psychologically, the imprint of the Frost sisters remained indelible. The Appalachian Mountains retained a hidden scar, a story whispered among families for decades, a cautionary tale that human terror can hide behind ordinary smiles and domestic routines. Even today, the site of the Frost homestead is silent, overgrown, and deceptively peaceful. Beneath layers of soil, debris, and new growth, stone foundations and remnants of the cellar endure. For those who know its history, a simple hike through the trees becomes an uneasy journey through a landscape shaped by fear, control, and human darkness. Next, we will examine the deeper psychological analysis of the Frost sisters, their shared trauma, and the eerie sibling dynamic that fueled their methodical cruelty. The Frost sisters' actions were not simply the result of isolation or opportunity. They were fueled by a bond that remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Margaret and Catherine were more than siblings. They were mirrors of one another, reflections of fear, trauma, and twisted survival instincts. From the moment their father died in 1883, leaving them alone in the harsh Appalachian Mountains, the sisters developed a shared worldview, one where danger was omnipresent and control was the only path to safety. Psychologists studying the case describe their relationship as a form of shared psychosis, a rare phenomenon where two individuals reinforce each other's distorted perceptions of reality. Margaret, the more outspoken of the two, took the role of strategist, interacting with the outside world, greeting travelers, and maintaining appearances. Catherine, whose unnerving silence and unblinking eyes were noted by every local who saw her in town, handled the technical aspects, preparing the drugs, managing the hidden chamber, and ensuring the mechanics of imprisonment ran flawlessly. Together, they created a system of predation that required both roles to function perfectly. What is especially chilling is the calm, methodical way they synchronized their actions. Observers during the trial remarked that Margaret never lost composure, even while describing atrocities she had participated in. While Catherine's silence was unsettling in its totality, she never flinched, never broke eye contact with a distant point, and never revealed any trace of ordinary human emotion. It was as if each sister drew strength from the other, forming a closed loop of fear, justification, and control. Margaret herself, on the witness stand, framed their actions as a defense mechanism. She claimed that the men they encountered were inherently dangerous, that society had not read them to protect themselves, and that the only way to survive was to preemptively remove threats. Catherine, though silent, was complicit at every stage. Their bond transformed fear into a calculated pattern of cruelty. Each act of control reinforced the other's sense of security, cementing a shared reality where imprisonment and starvation were rational measures. Criminal historians often cite this dynamic as a textbook example of how trauma can evolve into predation when reinforced within an isolated dyad. Unlike solitary serial offenders, the Frost sisters operated with collaboration, communication, and a precise division of labor. They were not improvising. They were executing a plan honed over years, sustained by mutual reinforcement of fear and moral distortion. Their bond also explains the chilling composure Margaret displayed after Catherine's death in jail. Her remark, "She always did finish things before me," was not merely stoic, it reflected the psychological fusion that had defined their lives. Even in the absence of her sister, Margaret's identity and rationalization remained inseparable from the pair's shared ideology. The bond, once forged, shaped every action, every manipulation, and every crime in the Frost homestead. Next, we will explore the methods and calculated cruelty of the Frost cellar, delving into the chamber's layout, their use of plants and drugs, and the precise orchestration that made their predation so systematic and horrifying. The Frost sisters' cellar was more than a hidden room beneath a homestead. It was a meticulously designed instrument of control, a place where fear, isolation, and physical suffering were methodically applied. Visitors to the Frost property never suspected the duality hidden beneath the root cellar. To the untrained eye, it was merely a storage area, a place for preserves, potatoes, and firewood. But inside, a carefully constructed second chamber awaited, sealed from the outside world, windowless, and designed to break both body and spirit. The chamber was deceptively simple in appearance, roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, with stone walls, a dirt floor, and a single bucket for human waste. But its terror lay in its calculated use. Margaret's hospitality drew the victims in, establishing trust before any threat became apparent. Travelers were convinced that sleeping in the cellar was safer than facing the mountain winds, just as she promised. Once they were settled, Margaret returned with a drink, subtly laced with a mixture of hemlock, jimson weed, and other wild Appalachian plants prepared by Catherine. The dosage was precise, carefully calibrated to weaken but not immediately kill, leaving the victims disoriented, unable to coordinate movement, and unable to resist effectively. Catherine's knowledge of plants and their effects was essential. She understood potency, timing, and interaction with human physiology, treating the concoctions almost mathematically. The drugged victims would lose strength gradually, allowing the sisters to transport them from the first chamber into the hidden second chamber without struggle. There was no need for brute force. The process was methodical, controlled, and chillingly calm. Once inside, the victims faced conditions designed to strip away autonomy and dignity. They were confined in darkness, deprived of warmth, light, or contact with the outside world. The bucket in the corner, left unemptied for weeks, forced them to confront the degradation of bodily neglect. Food and water were limited, regulated, and only provided to maintain a level of survivability. For those who remained alive, the days or weeks that followed were marked by isolation, confusion, and the constant knowledge of their helplessness. What makes the Frost cellar unique in criminal history is the sisters' approach to predation. The second chamber was not an execution room in the conventional sense. It was a place for psychological dominance. Survivors later described the terror of hearing the mundane lives of the sisters above. Footsteps, laughter, the sounds of bread baking or chickens clucking. It was a calculated juxtaposition, a cruel reminder that life continued outside the darkness they were trapped in, reinforcing their powerlessness. Forensic reports from 1889 describe injuries that were systematic and deliberate, emphasizing that the sisters' cruelty was methodical, not chaotic. Skeletons and partial remains recovered after the cellar's collapse revealed staggered decomposition, indicating repeated use over years. Margaret and Catherine weren't acting on impulse. They were executing a sustained strategic plan. Their cellar became both shield and weapon, a dark testament to the extremes of human ingenuity twisted by fear and obsession. Next, we will uncover the first confirmed victims, their last moments, and how early disappearances set the precedent for the Frost sisters' deadly pattern. The first confirmed victim of the Frost sisters was Thomas Wickham, a young surveyor working for a Pennsylvania mining company in late November of 1882. Wickham's task was simple: map mineral deposits in the rugged hills of West Virginia. Yet the journey that should have been routine ended abruptly at the Frost homestead. He paid Margaret Frost for a hot meal and a night's lodging, unaware that his trust would become his last decision. Thomas never reached the trading posts to the west. His equipment vanished with him, leaving only questions. In 1880s Appalachia, missing persons were often shrugged off. Many travelers had no families nearby, no employers tracking their movements, and no reason to raise an alarm. But Wickham's disappearance was different. Mining records noted his absence, prompting inquiries that reached the local sheriff. Margaret Frost's explanation was consistent. He left early, in good spirits, heading west. The sheriff, reassured by her calm composure, filed the report, and the trail went cold. What followed over the next 7 years was a series of disappearances that established a chillingly consistent pattern. At least 14 individuals vanished along the stretch of road near the Frost property. They were all men, traveling alone, ranging from their early 20s to late 50s. Each arrived at the Frost homestead in the late hours, often at dusk or after dark, and each fell victim to the same sequence: a warm welcome, a seemingly innocent offer to sleep in the cellar, and the gradual loss of strength from Catherine's carefully prepared concoctions. The consistency of the pattern was methodical, almost ritualistic. Margaret greeted them with a smile, served meals, and offered drinks that contained precisely measured doses of toxic plants. Once the victim was incapacitated, the sisters moved him to the hidden chamber. It was a process that demanded precision and teamwork. Margaret's outward charm and the illusion of hospitality were as essential as Catherine's botanical knowledge. Together, they transformed ordinary encounters into controlled predation. The victims' profiles reveal a calculated selection process. By choosing men traveling alone, the sisters minimized the chance of interference or rescue. By timing their arrival for dusk, or later, they ensured that fear of traveling in darkness would compel compliance. And by exploiting societal norms, where rejecting a woman's hospitality was considered impolite, they manipulated both psychology and culture. In each case, the victims had unknowingly consented to their own imprisonment, guided by a trust that had been weaponized against them. The early disappearances set a precedent for the sisters' escalating cruelty. The Frost homestead, initially a modest traveler's rest, became a machine of predation. With each victim, the sisters refined their methods, learning how to incapacitate, confine, and dominate more efficiently. By the late 1880s, their system was fully operational, with a hidden chamber, controlled doses, and a chilling understanding of human behavior that allowed them to maintain appearances above while systematically eroding lives below. Next, we will explore the flooding of 1889, the collapse of the cellar, and how nature itself revealed the horrific extent of the Frost sisters' crimes, exposing both bodies and secrets that had been meticulously hidden for years. March of 1889 brought an unrelenting storm to the Appalachian hills surrounding Hollow Creek. Snowmelt combined with 3 days of torrential rain, transforming quiet creeks into raging rivers and sending mudslides down every slope. Roads that were already treacherous became impassable, isolating homesteads and settlements. For most locals, it was a disaster. For the Frost sisters, it was the beginning of the end, though they could not have known it at the time. The floodwaters undermined the stone foundation of the Frost homestead's cellar. A portion of the exterior wall collapsed outward, revealing what had been concealed for years. 4 men from the nearest settlement, drawn by the sound of crumbling stone and the stench carried by the floodwaters, approached cautiously. What they encountered left them staggered, scattered bones and an odor so foul that even the cold mountain air could not mask it. Panic and disbelief overtook reason. They ran immediately to the county seat to alert authorities, setting in motion the investigation that would finally expose the sisters' crimes. 2 days later, the sheriff arrived with 6 deputies. What they discovered inside the hidden chamber would remain sealed in official records until 1973, considered too disturbing for public knowledge for decades. The chamber was windowless, dark, and confined. 3 men were still alive, their bodies weakened by starvation, dehydration, and the effects of carefully calculated toxins. 1 had been confined since late January, another since early February, while the 3rd remained incoherent until his death 4 days later. The conditions defied adequate description: emaciation, neglect, injuries inflicted over time, and the psychological torment of hearing the sisters living mundane lives above. The recovered remains of at least 9 other men were found within the chamber, some buried in the floor, others stacked in an excavation Catherine had dug deeper into the hillside. Decomposition suggested staggered use over years, and forensic observations noted deliberate, systematic injuries. These men had not died quickly. They had suffered slowly, under the watchful control of 2 women who maintained domestic normalcy above their victims. Margaret baked bread, tended chickens, and smiled at the next unsuspecting traveler, while below, life and dignity were stripped away with chilling precision. The flood inadvertently revealed the horrifying duality of the Frost homestead, a place that appeared welcoming and ordinary on the surface, yet beneath it, the sisters had orchestrated a cruel, methodical system of imprisonment, torment, and death. The natural disaster dismantled decades of secrecy, exposing a pattern that had eluded law enforcement, neighbors, and families of missing men for years. The flood and subsequent discovery didn't just unearth the physical evidence, it unveiled the psychology behind the sisters' crimes. It showed how isolation, fear, and the bond between Margaret and Catherine allowed them to rationalize the unimaginable and operate a system of calculated cruelty without interference. Next, we will delve into the survivors' accounts, exploring the horrors they endured, the long-term trauma, and the chilling perspective of those who lived to tell what happened in the frost cellar. The three men who survived the frost cellar did so by sheer endurance, but survival came at a cost far beyond physical injury. Their accounts, recorded by law enforcement and later journalists, reveal horrors that transcend the body and enter the realm of psychological torment. The survivors weren't merely weakened, they had endured prolonged captivity, deprivation, and the calculated cruelty of two women who treated them as objects rather than human beings. Jacob Reinhardt, one of the three, provided the most detailed recollections. He described the cellar as a living nightmare. Darkness that seemed to press in from every direction, silence broken only by the faint sounds from above. Margaret and Catherine moving through the house, baking, laughing, living. The mundane normalcy of the sisters' lives was worse than the confinement itself, a constant reminder that he was forgotten, dehumanized, and powerless. The dissonance between the world above and the hell below shattered him psychologically, leaving scars that never healed. The second survivor, whose name appears only in county records, was incapacitated for months. His body endured starvation and injuries, but his mind bore the weight of the experience far longer. He could no longer enter dark rooms without panic. Nightmares plagued him relentlessly, filled with images of ladders, stairs, and the unseen hands that had moved him from chamber to chamber. Each memory was punctuated by the sounds of domestic life above, a cruel echo of normalcy amidst suffering. The third man lived until 1923 but never spoke of the ordeal. Family accounts describe repeated panic attacks, compulsive behaviors, and fear of enclosed spaces. He checked every door, multiple times each night, ensuring they opened from the inside. The cellar had reshaped his perception of safety, instilling a permanent anxiety rooted in helplessness and terror. Survivor testimonies highlighted a disturbing consistency in the sisters' methods. They were patient, precise, and unflinching. Food, water, and minimal care were given only enough to prolong suffering. The men were intentionally kept alive, their bodies weakened gradually, their spirits crushed incrementally. Forensic reports corroborated this, noting methodical injuries and deliberate neglect, an ongoing experiment in control and domination. Perhaps most chilling was the sisters' psychological manipulation. Margaret framed their actions as education, insisting they were teaching dangerous men a lesson about power and submission. Survivors heard these rationalizations repeatedly as the sisters operated above, reinforcing the sense of moral distortion. To Margaret and Catherine, survival was not the goal, it was control. Those who failed to learn the lesson paid with their lives. Those who survived carried the trauma forever. These accounts reveal a fundamental truth about the Frost sisters' crimes. The horror was not only in death, but in the prolonged stripping of autonomy and dignity. The cellar was more than a chamber. It was a theater of terror, where life, not death, was the punishment. The survivors' minds were left fractured, their understanding of trust, safety, and human kindness forever altered by the calculated cruelty of two women hiding behind smiles and hospitality. Next, we will explore the trial of the Frost sisters, their arrest, and the public's reaction to one of the most notorious cases in Appalachian history. March of 1889 marked the end of the Frost sisters' freedom, but it began quietly. When deputies arrived at the homestead, the scene contrasted sharply with the horror lurking beneath the surface. Margaret Frost answered the door as she had for decades, with a calm smile and courteous hospitality, offering coffee and a chair to the officers. Catherine was upstairs, reading in silence. There was no panic, no attempt to flee. Their arrest was surreal, almost mundane, as if the everyday routines of life could coexist with the unspeakable crimes hidden beneath the house. The trial commenced in late May at the county courthouse, drawing attention far beyond West Virginia. People traveled for days to witness the proceedings, filling the seats and standing room for miles around. Journalists arrived from Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York, eager to capture the story of the she-devils of Appalachia, as the New York Times would later label them. This was not the era of sensationalist headlines. The horror was evident without exaggeration. The public recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be etched into regional memory for generations. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Bones and personal effects recovered from the hidden chamber corroborated the survivors' accounts. Testimonies detailed the precise, systematic cruelty of the sisters and the hidden chamber that had entrapped men for weeks, even months. Every witness emphasized the same eerie contrast: normal domestic life above, torment below. The court documents meticulously described emaciation, untreated injuries, and psychological degradation. The physical evidence alone painted a picture so disturbing that even seasoned law enforcement officers struggled to process it. Yet the question on everyone's mind was not just what happened, but why. Margaret Frost's testim, only on the stand, lasted 4 hours. Calm, articulate, and almost professorial, she explained the sisters' actions through the lens of fear and self-preservation. She recounted incidents where travelers had advanced upon Catherine or refused to leave, framing their subsequent actions as defensive, necessary to neutralize threats before they could act. She insisted repeatedly that they were not murderers. They were educators. The men in the cellar, she claimed, were being taught a lesson about power, vulnerability, and respect. Those who survived would never harm a woman again. Those who failed to understand perished. Catherine Frost never spoke during the trial. Observers noted her eerie stillness, hands folded in her lap, eyes staring straight ahead as if she existed in a world entirely apart from the courtroom. Her silence amplified the horror, contrasting with Margaret's calm explanations, leaving jurors and spectators unnerved and uncertain how to reconcile outward composure with inner depravity. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, a reflection of the clarity of evidence and the shock of witnesses. Both sisters were convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault with intent to cause suffering. The judge set the execution date for July 12, 1889. Outside the courthouse, the townspeople reacted with a mixture of fascination, fear, and revulsion. News spread quickly, cementing the sisters' place in regional infamy. Next, we will examine the mysterious death of Catherine Frost, the expedited execution of Margaret, and the final days of a family legacy erased from Appalachia forever. The time between sentencing and execution was brief, but filled with tension and uncertainty. On June 23, 1889, just weeks before the scheduled execution, Catherine Frost was found dead in her cell. The official record declared suicide. She had allegedly torn strips from her bedding and hanged herself from the cell bars. However, eyewitness accounts from 3 deputies on duty that night contradicted each other. One claimed she had been asleep at midnight, another insisted the cell was never left unattended, and the third refused to provide any statement, resigning shortly afterward. The truth of Catherine's death remains ambiguous, a chilling final act shrouded in mystery. Margaret Frost's response to her sister's death was equally unnerving. Witnesses described a calm nod, almost as if acknowledging a completed task, with the chilling remark, "She always did finish things before me." There was no overt grief, no emotional outburst, only the quiet acceptance of inevitability. The event accelerated the legal process. The execution, originally scheduled for July 12th, was moved forward. Margaret would face the gallows alone, her sister already removed from the narrative. On June 30th, 1889, approximately 200 people gathered at the county courthouse yard to witness the execution. Newspaper accounts describe Margaret walking unassisted to the platform, her posture composed, her gaze steady. The executioner asked if she had any final words. According to multiple newspaper reports and a deputy's diary, Margaret's statement echoed the twisted rationale she had maintained throughout the trial. "You think we were monsters, but we only did to them what they would have done to us. We were just faster." Even in her final moments, she framed her actions as necessary, defensive, and justified in her own mind. 4 days after the execution, The Frost homestead was destroyed by towns, people. Not by official mandate, but by communal decision. They burned the main house, the outbuildings, and attempted to collapse the stone cellar, filling it with rocks and debris. Within 2 years, the land was unrecognizable. The logging road was rerouted, and the families remaining in what had been Hollow Creek moved away. By 1895, the settlement no longer appeared on maps. The erasure was so thorough that even decades later, only locals could point to where the house once stood, a testament to collective memory and fear. The consequences of the Frost sisters' crimes extended beyond their deaths. Families of the victims were left with fragmented pieces of identity and closure. Personal effects, pocket watches, letters, rings, were returned, but many victims remained unidentified, listed only as unknown males associated with the Frost property. The trauma was not confined to those who had perished or survived. It rippled through the region. Hospitality became suspect. Travelers were wary of remote homes, particularly those run by solitary women. Legitimate travelers' rests lost business, and the Appalachian tradition of trust and assistance was irreversibly altered. Even in death, Margaret and Catherine Frost defined the landscape. They transformed not only the lives of the men they held captive, but also the culture of an entire community. Their story was not simply one of crime, but of fear, power, and the haunting legacy of choices made in isolation and desperation. The land itself became a silent witness, hiding the cellar beneath trees, soil, and time. Next, we will explore how the Frost legacy influenced Appalachian society, altering cultural perceptions of trust, hospitality, and the dangers of isolation for decades to come. The execution of Margaret Frost and the mysterious death of Catherine did not close the chapter on the Frost legacy. It only marked the beginning of a new, subtler form of terror. The story of their crimes reverberated through Appalachian society, reshaping local attitudes toward hospitality, trust, and isolation. For decades afterward, the region bore the imprint of their actions, not just in memory, but in behavior. Before the Frost sisters, the Appalachian Mountains were a place where travelers could rely on the goodwill of strangers. Remote homesteads often functioned as travelers' rests, offering warmth, food, and shelter to those journeying through harsh winter roads and treacherous mountain passes. It was a tradition of survival, a pact of mutual dependence. The Frost sisters shattered that implicit trust. Communities that had once seen offering a meal as simple decency now approached hospitality with suspicion. Men traveling alone began refusing offers to sleep in cellars or outbuildings, insisting instead on main rooms or avoiding stops entirely. Women running legitimate travelers' rests found themselves suddenly without patrons, their livelihoods disrupted by fear seeded decades earlier. Historians and psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. The Frost case illustrates how trauma, especially when perpetrated by those considered vulnerable themselves, can ripple outward, affecting entire communities. The sisters weren't motivated by profit or greed. Their crimes were born from fear, isolation, and a perverse sense of self-preservation. Yet the result was the erosion of trust, a communal fear that lingered far longer than the women themselves. The Appalachian approach to strangers was never quite the same again. Cultural memory preserved the story through oral history, family anecdotes, and sporadic newspaper reports, even after maps erased. Hollow Creek and physical traces of the Frost homestead disappeared. Tales of the sisters became cautionary legends whispered to children, warnings not only of evil, but of human vulnerability. The chilling lesson was clear. Sometimes danger comes from those who seem harmless, those whose domestic routines and smiles mask a calculated capacity for cruelty. Criminal psychologists have used the Frost sisters as a case study for over a century. Their behavior exemplifies shared psychosis, the blurring of trauma and predation, and the dangers of isolation amplified by fear. Margaret and Catherine transformed fear into power, creating a system where victims were not just killed, but broken, physically and psychologically. Their actions demonstrated that evil is not always overt. It can wear the most ordinary of faces, offering kindness while plotting destruction. Even in modern Appalachia, echoes remain. Local historians point to the rerouted logging roads, abandoned plots, and subtle warnings about isolated cabins as remnants of collective memory. The Frost legacy serves as both a historical fact and a moral allegory, a reminder of how a single family's fear and trauma can extend outward, warping social norms and altering behaviors for generations. Next, we will dive into the forensic rediscovery of the Frost property in the 20th century and how modern investigation uncovered the remaining traces of the sisters' crimes hidden beneath over a century of forest and soil. Decades passed, and the memory of the Frost sisters' crimes faded from official records, maps, and daily conversation. Hollow Creek was erased from geography, its roads rerouted, houses abandoned, and the land reclaimed by dense Appalachian forest. Yet, beneath layers of soil, trees, and time, the remnants of the Frost property endured. Foundations of the homestead, collapsed cellar walls, and overgrown trails remained hidden evidence of the terror that had unfolded more than a century earlier. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that historians and amateur archaeologists began exploring the region systematically. Interest was initially sparked by a combination of local folklore and sparse archival materials, newspaper clippings, county records, and a few surviving coroner reports. The goal was not sensationalism, but historical documentation, to understand what had happened and why an entire community had tried to erase the site from memory. The most significant breakthrough came in the 1970s, when a local historian working through property deeds and surveying old logging routes identified the approximate location of the Frost homestead. The logging road was almost entirely overgrown. Trees had risen through what remained of the stone foundation, and moss-covered depressions marked where the cellar had once been. Despite these obstacles, a careful excavation revealed remnants of the root cellar, including fragments of stone walls and charred debris, likely remnants of the community's deliberate attempt to destroy the structure. Inside the depression, archaeologists found traces of what could only have been the second chamber described in 19th century accounts. Small artifacts, fragments of personal effects, glass jars, and remnants of wooden partitions suggested a space that had been carefully constructed for concealment. Soil analysis indicated human remains had outdoors. Ants been present, though none were recoverable by this point due to decomposition and decades of environmental exposure. Still, the layout and evidence matched descriptions from court and coroner reports with eerie precision, validating decades of historical narrative. Investigators were struck not just by the physical traces, but by the psychological impression of the site. The cellar's architecture revealed a chilling duality, a comfortable front space designed to lull travelers into trust, and a hidden chamber engineered for confinement and control. Even a century later, the spatial design communicated calculated intent. Walking through the site, historians reported an almost visceral sense of unease, an emotional echo of the suffering that had occurred there. The rediscovery prompted renewed research into regional archives. Surviving court transcripts, newspaper articles, and family records were cross-referenced, reconstructing the story of the Frost sisters with unprecedented clarity. Scholars began to analyze the sisters' actions within the framework of trauma, fear, and predatory psychology, noting how isolation and cultural norms around gender may have contributed to the development of their lethal system. The Frost case, once obscured, became a key study in female serial predation and shared psychosis. Yet for all the academic interest, the site remained largely silent. No memorials, markers, or formal recognition exist. The forest swallows the depression where the cellar once was, and only those who actively seek it out can find traces of the horrors buried beneath roots and stone. The rediscovery, though significant, underscored the deliberate erasure. The way a community sought to bury not just a building, but the memory of what had transpired there. Next, we will explore how the Frost case continues to influence modern criminology and the study of traumas, fear, and predatory behavior more than a century after their crimes. Over a century has passed since Margaret and Catherine Frost were taken from the world, yet their crimes continue to fascinate, horrify, and instruct modern scholars. The Frost sisters are studied not simply as historical curiosities, but as a rare window into the intersections of trauma, isolation, and female criminality. Their case remains one of the most detailed examples of predation born from fear and survival instinct, challenging traditional narratives of serial violence which have historically focused on men. Criminologists studying female serial killers point to Margaret and Catherine as pioneers in what some researchers now call domestic predation. a type of violence emerging from private, enclosed spaces rather than public or opportunistic environments. Unlike typical cases motivated by profit, revenge, or sexual desire, the Frost sisters' actions were motivated by a perceived need to control threat, to neutralize what they saw as danger to their survival. This challenges assumptions about rationality, morality, and gendered behavior in criminal psychology. The sisters weren't killing for pleasure. They were controlling, and in that control lay a horrifying precision. Shared psychosis, or folie à deux, is another area where the Frost case is cited extensively. Margaret and Catherine acted as a single operational unit, reinforcing each other's fears, rationalizations, and methods. Psychologists note that isolation amplified their shared delusions and created a feedback loop. Fear produced preemptive aggression, which reinforced their sense of danger, which justified further aggression. It's a textbook example of how psychological pathology can evolve into sustained, systematic predation when combined with social isolation and cultural norms that limit intervention. The story also informs studies of trauma and survival. Margaret's testimony made it clear that their father had instilled a perception of men as threats, and that his death left them vulnerable in a male-dominated society. Scholars argue that the sisters' environment, a remote Appalachian homestead, harsh winters, and minimal oversight, created the conditions for trauma to transform into predation. In essence, the Frost sisters became a case study in how systemic vulnerability, compounded over years, can twist fear into violence. Even outside academic circles, the Frost sisters have influenced cultural and social understanding of risk, trust, and hospitality. Folklore, novels, and regional storytelling continue to reference the frost cellar, often as a warning about the dangers hidden behind everyday kindness. Anthropologists note a measurable change in Appalachian practices. Solitary travelers historically sought warmth and food from strangers, but after the Frost case, men became wary, and women had to navigate the delicate balance of offering help while avoiding suspicion. The sisters weaponized trust itself, leaving a ripple effect that outlasted their physical presence. Yet, perhaps the most haunting legacy is ethical. The Frost sisters force us to confront the uncomfortable idea that victims, scarred, vulnerable, and desperate, can become perpetrators. Margaret's words at her execution resonate in this context. We were just faster. History, psychology, and morality intertwine in their story, reminding us that evil is rarely black and white, and that fear, when unchecked, can manifest in unspeakable ways. Standing in the shadow of the Appalachian forest today, the Frost property appears almost innocuous. No sign marks the spot. No stone commemorates the lives lost or the horrors endured beneath the soil. Yet, if you look closely, the land itself whispers of what once occurred. A shallow depression hinting at the root cellar, trees pushing through the remnants of stone walls, a quiet so profound it feels almost reverent. Nature has reclaimed the homestead, but the history it covers is indelible. The Frost sisters' crimes left more than bones and charred timber. They left a moral echo that continues to haunt observers, historians, and communities alike. One of the most unsettling truths of the Frost case is the way it blurs the line between victim and perpetrator. Margaret and Catherine were women shaped by fear, by a society that offered them little protection, and by a childhood steeped in warnings against men. Their actions were extreme, horrific, and calculated, yet they were rooted in vulnerability and trauma. Psychologists studying the case emphasize this duality. The Frost sisters were both prey and predator, and their story challenges the simplistic idea of evil as inherent. Sometimes it is cultivated, nurtured, and weaponized from a place of fear. The cultural impact is equally profound. The Appalachian communities surrounding the Frost homestead were forever altered. The instinct to trust strangers, a cornerstone of survival in a harsh, isolated region, was replaced by caution, suspicion, and avoidance. Local practices changed. Travelers became wary of welcoming hands, and women offering shelter had to negotiate the dangerous legacy of fear left by the sisters. The Frost story became both cautionary tale and moral lesson, illustrating how trauma can ripple outward, touching the lives of those who never encountered the perpetrators directly. From a historical perspective, The Frost sisters serve as a rare case where the mechanisms of concealment, predation, and survival intersected so clearly. Modern investigators and forensic historians have pieced together their methods with astonishing clarity, revealing a system meticulously designed to manipulate trust and exploit isolation. Even after more than a century, the remnants of the cellar, combined with archival evidence, create a chilling portrait of methodical cruelty. It is a reminder that evil, when embedded in ordinary domesticity, can be invisible until it is too late. Perhaps the most haunting legacy, however, lies in the survivors. The 3 men who escaped, or were found alive, never recovered fully. They carried with them the psychological scars, the memory of confinement, hunger, and helplessness, while the sisters moved above them, living mundane lives. Their trauma highlights the enduring human cost, not only of direct violence, but of witnessing the ordinary continuation of life while one is stripped of humanity. The Frost sisters may be gone, their house burned, their cellar buried, but their story refuses to be forgotten. It reminds us that history is not only what we commemorate, but also what we choose to confront, no matter how uncomfortable. Evil does not always announce itself with thunder or blood. Sometimes it comes quietly, behind smiles, behind doors, and in moments of misplaced trust. The Frost sisters forced a community, and perhaps all of us, to reckon with that reality. Before we close this story, reflect on this. History preserves not just the events, but the lessons embedded in fear, morality, and human psychology. The Frost cellar may be silent now, but its echoes remain. A warning, a study, a memory of what 2 women, shaped by isolation and fear, could accomplish. The shadows of the past linger longer than stone and soil ever could,